So again, welcome everybody to the Washington Crossing American Revolution Roundtable. We're going to be hearing tonight from Gary Ecelbarger. Many of you have heard Gary speak here or elsewhere before. Recently, he has written two books, two volumes about George Washington's momentous year. And so we're going to be hearing from him tonight about George Washington's rally at the Battle of Monmouth, a period of about 90 minutes.
I want to thank Bob for inviting me back. I spoke to this group less than a year and a half ago, 2 Decembers ago, and that talk was a topic on Valley Forge, which is in the early part of my second volume of George Washington's momentous year. The second half of that book is dedicated to the Monmouth campaign and its immediate aftermath. So the topic I'm choosing tonight, because it's impossible for me to do justice to the entire campaign and the battle, it's a complicated process. I want to focus on George Washington's rally, which had many components to it. In fact, this painting, which isn't a really well-known painting, but a New Jersey mid 1800s artist and woodcutter named John R. Chapin is credited for this. It's not on public display, although you can see it online, and it's called the Battle of Monmouth, 1778. So, like most artists of that period, he will tend to combine many aspects of the battlefield as if they were happening simultaneously. In the case of the rally, I like that because Washington's rally had many different components to it, including a confrontation, setting up troops, and a true rouse up the troops like you're seeing in this painting in itself. There are more visible public displays of the rally that you can see physically without having to go online for it. These two paintings are both in galleries that can be viewed, and they're painted by the same artist. The artist is Emmanuel Loitzy, who I'm sure is a familiar name for those of you who know about Washington's Crossing. That famous painting of 1851 was followed by this grand painting. Actually, the biggest one is, even though it doesn't appear that way, is the one at the bottom. I'm just showing its public display in the University of California at Berkeley Art Museum. That's a 21 foot by 13-foot painting. Loitzy was commissioned by a Brooklyn banker named David Levitt to produce that. Levitt, the same guy, commissioned him to make a more private painting about a third of the size for his daughter a few years later. And that's the image.
Participate?
No,
Somebody's going to have to.
because I got
Richard Morgan, you're going to have to mute.
turned out, I
Everyone.
thought it was off a military trail, but it turned out
Richard Morgan, you're going to have to mute.
that it was in the Gardens Mall. And there's
Gary, I just muted everybody. I'm going to ask you to unmute in just a second. There you go.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
All right, you're back.
All right, I think that helps. Sorry about that, folks. So we have two paintings by the same artist. They look the same. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes and show what the difference was and why. And finally, if you want to see an image of the rally for free, go no further than Freehold, and you will see the Grand Monmouth Battle Monument. This is over 90 feet tall. It's in a park just outside, across the street from the current courthouse, not the original, which no longer exists. But at the bottom of that monument that you see on the right-hand side, you see that dark wrapping of bas-relief panels. There's 5 of them. And each of those depicts a key moment in the campaign, and most of those in the battle itself, including what now looks like this weather-worn one of Washington rallying the troops. The monument, by the way, the cornerstone was laid exactly on the centennial on June 28th, 1878, by then Governor and former Civil War General George McClellan. It took about 6 more years to complete the monument, but that can be viewed for free. So there's a public display of the rally, and the rally's well depicted and well covered. I think, although the Ken Burns series did some weird things with the Battle of Monmouth, I think they covered the rally very well. And most people that write about it give Washington his due on what occurred during, at least for parts of it, during the rally. But you tend to see more of a backhanded compliment to Washington at the Battle of Monmouth, and I saw that to the extreme. I could give you the personal story. 3 weeks ago, I was a participant speaking at a Revolutionary War conference in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and one of the speakers that spoke about Charles Lee and the Battle of Monmouth actually said, and he used this as an idiom, not the time isn't literal, but he said this clearly wasn't Washington's finest hour, talking about the Battle of Monmouth. So I haven't seen criticisms that harsh, and I was able to let that one go through without commenting too strongly on it. So here's the issue with Washington. There's a 21st century spin on him that's actually very surprising to me because it goes against the grain of the evidence that suggests otherwise. And while I'm on the topic of images, you see these three images of Washington right here. They're closest to representing him at the time of the battle. I'll give you an example. The two that are on the bookends, on the right and on the left-hand side is a painting completed during Valley Forge from a sketch that was actually made by Washington sitting for it, posing for it, 9 months before the Battle of Monmouth. And the image on the right is also one that Washington sat for, and the sketch for that one by the same artist, Peale, was created 7 months after the Battle of Monmouth. And I put on the bottom a John Trumbull, who had several paintings that included Washington alone or in the midst of them. And Trumbull, in old age, 1831, I believe, will call this image that I'm showing here as the one that best represents Washington at his peak in the Revolutionary War, which is during this period itself. So here's the spin that you see on Washington, and I've got the challenges to that spin written below. The spin, for example, is that Washington wasn't a very good field commander and lost all of his battles. Well, if you look at the tactical outcomes of the battles in which Washington personally led forces on the field, by the summer of 78, he has won more battles than he has lost against an elite world army, the Crown Force Army. And the marker for the tactical victory that you will always see by the soldiers is the term masters of the field. I'm going to bring that up a little bit later. Washington is at this period the undisputed commander of the Continental Army of the United States forces of all theaters. There was a true cabal against him the previous winter, but it has been resolved since February. So over the last 4 months, any criticisms of Washington are muted. There is no public attempt to take his power. There is no backstabbing attempts that I can see in the literature after the winter months. So Washington is undisputed in charge of the army, and he doesn't need the subsequent campaign to solidify that leadership. That's not the reason why he's embarking on it. He is consistently aggressive. He's always constantly seeking a general engagement. And this tends to fly in the face of what you've heard about Washington being a Fabian strategist or a Fabian tactician who's always looking for a war of posts or a war of avoidance. I'll give you some very strong examples of this that occurred during the campaign that lead to the Battle of Monmouth. And what I've noticed as I was working on the book, I've studied, by my count, 18 councils of war that were held in a 10-month period between August of 77, starting at the one at the Moreland House, and going all the way into June of 1778. And progressively over time, Washington dismisses those councils as determinants, democratic determinants of action. He's looking at the opinions of his generals, his subordinates, feeling their pulse, so to speak, but he is the one in charge. He's calling the shots. And the generals, for the ones that have served under him long enough, well realize that. And going with the comment above, they tend to realize that he's always looking for a general engagement, and they might very strongly make some recommendations against that. I'll give you some examples during this presentation about that as well. The reason why I'm bringing up the Councils of War is that one of those bas-relief panels on the Monmouth Monument, the Battle Monument, is this one that you see here. It's much more weather-beaten than the nice true relief one that you see in this image, but it shows the Council of War that was held a few days before the battle on Wednesday morning, June 24th at Hopewell, New Jersey. And Washington will call in his generals. And let me set the scene. to bring the campaign. This is a Reader's Digest version of the Reader's Digest version, very short. But the Crown forces, because of the new French alliance with the United States, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, realizing that they are now in a world war, the powers that be across the sea realize they need a reallocation of British forces to cover their interests, for example, in the Caribbean. And because of that, some forces are stripped away from the British occupation of Philadelphia, which has lasted for about 10 months. And the remainder of that force, now under the command of Henry Clinton, has been ordered to work their way to New York, where they have held their base of operations since the summer of 1776. So, beginning on June 17th, 18th, Clinton will cross the Delaware at Cooper's Ferry in Gloucester, and he will begin his march in that direction. Washington is well aware of it. His spies have indicated this, his military confirms it, and he will leave Valley Forge in two tiers. That's TIERS on the 18th and on the 19th, with a 21,000 man army that will enter New Jersey, counting militia and Continentals, and will parallel that British movement. But by and large, the bulk of Washington's Grand Army is about 20 miles north of Henry Clinton. And this is where this council is being held, well away from that army, but moving in concert with them. And Washington's trying to feel the pulse of his generals, and he will get their opinions. I'll talk more about what some of them say at this council a little later on. But to highlight just a couple of people that I will bring up in the talk, sitting here at the lower left in this panel is General Henry Knox. Sitting at the lower right with the dog underneath the chair is none other than Major General Charles Lee, who's a key figure in the reason for the rally. And of the three generals standing to Washington's right, he's the one at the far end of the table with Lafayette at the close end of the table standing. Our three standing generals, the one in the middle is Anthony Wayne. And I'm bringing Wayne up for a reason. Here is examples of Washington seeking a large battle in documents in which I highlighted in yellow the evidence for seeking the general engagement, if you want to interpret it that way. Now, whenever I put a very wordy slide up here, I'm not going to read this all off to you folks. You guys can read that on your own. I'm going to explain it in general terms and maybe highlight a couple of points. In this case, I want to focus on Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. There have been two councils. He was at one at Valley Forge on the 17th of June, and he was very bellicose in that one, advocating for a general engagement as a first line of action against the British Army. He's muted his bellicosity at the Hopewell Conference and writes this out to Washington, in which he says that he will accept a general engagement, but it shouldn't be the first policy to have the Army necessitated to engage. Look how he ends that sentence, though. Contrary to your own desire, because he knows very well, because he knows George Washington throughout the war at this stage. He knows that Washington's seeking big battles, and Washington didn't start out that council saying, I'm looking for a general engagement, but Wayne already realizes that, and that's why he adds, contrary to your own desire, even though Washington probably never said that to him. I'll give you an example later on where Henry Knox pretty much shows the same thing by very bluntly telling Washington it would be criminal to get involved with a general engagement. He's really trying to tamp down anything that Washington might desire. Your best evidence of Washington seeking a large battle is the first orders he has of the first commander of the advance corps, and I'm going to explain that in the next slide what the advance corps is. That's Lafayette. It's a short command that Lafayette has, but Washington's written instructions to Lafayette, and at this time Lafayette's force contains 7,500 officers and men. It's a small army, and it's detached from the main army. And Washington tells Lafayette that you will attack them as occasion may require by detachment. Look at the rest of the phrase. He says if the opportunity arises to use your whole force, then use the whole force. Now, this is an excerpt. Washington has stipulations that the Grand Army is in supporting distance and some other stipulations as well. But he's given Lafayette the green light to essentially get involved in a general engagement if the opportunity arises. Excuse the anachronism. I guess I said green light there, right? So Washington definitely is seeking a large battle. All right. What is the advance corps and why is he doing this? It's during this campaign, Washington has has a very dichotomous army, I guess is the best way I can explain it, leaving Valley Forge. At one end, he's got, of that 21,000 men that enter New Jersey, 18,000 of them are roughly Continental infantry, and of that, Washington has over 11,000 veterans of the Saratoga and Philadelphia campaigns of '77 who have stayed on through Valley Forge and received 10 great weeks of training by Baron de Steuben beginning in March. That is an elite force. It's the best trained and experienced army he has ever had, and they're joining him in New Jersey, but they are mixed with 5,000 new levies, draftees, and recruits that have joined this army, and over 3,000 of them have come in the last 5 weeks of the Valley Forge encampment. In fact, in June, they're coming in at a clip of 120 a day. They're flooding the camp, and there's no way that these soldiers received any adequate training by the time the Army leaves Valley Forge. So Washington's forced to put his best foot forward. And the way he does that is I'm going to use experienced commanders like Daniel Morgan and Charles Scott and Anthony Wayne, and I'm going to have them pick the best troops out of the 16 brigades that are with them to form this advanced corps. And the advanced corps is literal. They're going to be advanced away from the Grand Army, much closer to the British Army, waiting to strike it when the opportunity arises, with the general in charge of the whole thing. And at the bottom, I included William Maxwell, only because he doesn't technically have a picked force, but his very large brigade includes his 4 New Jersey regiments that are very experienced, very well trained. And because they were detached from the Grand Army, they didn't have any of their best men taken away from them by the 3 commanders that you see above them. So he's got an elite group of men in his New Jersey regiments as well by their training and experience. The problem with Maxwell is he's overloaded with 540 new recruits. So it's a mixed bag with Maxwell. Look at the numbers I'm giving you. And I want to bring this up now, and I will have a very strong reason for it. It goes against the grain of anybody, any historian that you've ever read on a campaign, and because they will always requote the numbers that are used contemporarily, if I could use that as an adverb. And that is whenever a force is depicted, its strength, they always tell you a certain number of men, or they might use the word rank and file. Those are interchangeable. That only means infantrymen, privates, and corporals, mostly somebody that's shouldering a firelock, right, or a rifle in this case. So in doing that, you are disregarding other soldiers that are accompanying the army, all the officers, artillery, for example, non-coms, even fife and drums, and I'm including everybody in those numbers that I'm giving you. I will show you the very important reason why that has to be done in just a few slides. So hang on, you'll see the reason. But this is the true size of these forces. Daniel Morgan truly has over 900 Continentals in his force, and that's including all officers and men. And with militia added to it, it'll get close to 1,000. All right, so here's a screenshot of a Google map. Why did I do this? Well, the key reason is look in the upper right at position 4, and you will see, because this map highlights it better than most period maps do, it shows clearly heights, hills. This is the heights of Middletown. The actual town of Middletown is off the page to the north, but those heights is the destination point that Washington fears that Henry Clinton will achieve on Sunday, June 28th. Clinton and his army, numbering a little over 19,000 officers and men, are on both sides of Freehold and through the town of Freehold, New Jersey, where position 3 is. In fact, they go as far as 3 miles south, so they go off the page as well. And Washington worries that because he's been there resting since the afternoon of Friday the 26th, that at first nautical light on Sunday, 4 o'clock in the morning, when the weather's its coolest during a week in which every day the temperature's gotten to 95 degrees or above, that Clinton will get an early march. And as you see by my ruler, as the crow flies, it's less than 10 miles. But by continental roads, depending if you're in the vanguard or rear of that force, if if you start the day early enough, you could be all settled in those heights of Middletown by the afternoon of Sunday. That's what Washington doesn't want to have happen because he cannot attack him there. That would be Bunker Hill in reverse, right? So Washington wants to hit him at the most vulnerable terrain where he can achieve at least a partial engagement, and that is going to be in the region south of Freehold, where the ground is lower. All right. Where's Washington's force dispersed? Well, he's got about 2,000 advanced corps troops, a lot of cavalry and militia, for example, but also Daniel Morgan, circling close to that British Army, the Crown Force Army, which is British, Hessians, and Loyalists. But much further away, the bulk of the advance corps is at Englishtown at position 2. That is 5.5 miles up the Cranberry Freehold Road. And that force is 6,500 officers and men, and 4,000 of those are elite picked troops. 4 miles further up the road is the remainder of the Grand Army, 14 brigades and artillery. It's a well picked over force of 10,000 officers and men, and Washington is, at least for part of the day, is personally there as well. Washington has a geometry lesson, and he knows he's going to have to attack Clinton if he's going to battle him at all before he gets to those heights of Middletown. And the only way he can do that is to hit him in the morning of June 28th. So Washington will ride to Englishtown, have a meeting with generals on Saturday, and then repeat the instructions by written orders at midnight, Saturday night, Sunday morning, which will get delivered and received in Englishtown on Sunday morning. That leads us now to the new commander of the Advance Corps after Lafayette. And I should show this. The exact point that Washington wants to attack is what I said was off the page. That's Charles Cornwallis in charge of elite British troops 3 miles south of Monmouth Courthouse. No longer standing, but that's what it looked like in 1778. And Washington's eyeing that as the point of attack. In charge of that advance corps now is Charles Lee. He is at Englishtown. And I guess no better example of the enigma of Charles Lee is represented than this collage of images of him, because to the best of our knowledge, he has never posed for any sketch or painting in his life. These are all artist creations of him. Some of them are caricatures, because we do have physical descriptions of Charles Lee, and none of them are very flattering, but he never posed for any of these paintings. So Charles Lee, let me bring this up really quickly. I'm setting this all up because he's going to be the reason for the rally. He is, as one artillerist says, the second officer upon the continent. He's the second in command. And he has been in captivity for 16 months. He's missed a lot of the war since December of 76 until his parole and exchange in April and May of 78. He rejoins Washington with 1 month left at Valley Forge, and he moves out with the Grand Army and is now in charge of the Advance Corps, which includes the 6,500 men at Englishtown, and the total force that he's in charge of is an army, 9,200 men in that Advance Corps, counting all the noses of the soldiers that are under his command. Charles Lee has been very vocal in this campaign that this elite British Army, and he has a lot of respect for them, is a force that the Americans, even though they're supposedly trained, in his opinion, still can't stand toe to toe in them in an open field fight. And in that Hopewell Council, according to Lafayette's memoir, Lee used the term that a bridge of gold should be built across New Jersey to allow Clinton's force to go unscathed all the way to New York. Don't mess with them, especially with the brand new, fresh French alliance in your pocket, George Washington. Don't attempt to engage them and suffer a catastrophe against them. But after that, Lee begged, essentially, cajoled Washington to take charge of this advance corps. Washington dismissed those entreaties for a day, and then finally realized that Lee is second in command and he needs to be given charge of it. So Lee is given charge of the advance corps, and Washington will give him those orders for the attack. Now, as I said earlier, there has been a 21st century spin given a different impression of George Washington than the examples that I presented to you by primary source evidence. Likewise, there has been a more favorable or sympathetic look at Charles Lee than what has happened for 200 years. I would say over the last 50 years, and particularly this century, everybody that's written about Lee as a biographer or about the Battle of Monmouth, not exclusively, but by and large, they've been very sympathetic to him. And their claim, and I'm going to get ahead of the game to tell you this, 2 days after this battle, Charles Lee will be arrested and court-martialed. He'll be found guilty eventually of 3 court-martial charges, including disobedience of orders and not attacking the enemy, subject to repeat instructions to him. And the reason for the sympathetic look at Charles Lee by biographers and campaign historians is that they follow Lee's line of thinking, and this is part of his defense, in saying that the orders that he received from George Washington were by no means precise and positive, but in a great measure discretionary. At least that's the way he conceived them. So if you are writing about Lee and you believe Lee, despite what others have said, you are going to be more sympathetic to him and saying that he didn't disobey an attack order if he didn't receive one. Well, my point is he definitely did receive an attack order, and I'm going to show you what was in the written instructions given to Lee that essentially turned the positive orders that Washington laid out in a council with Lee and other generals at Englishtown is now going to be made very precise. Here are the positive orders made precise in what we call the Hamilton letter. The letter doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared in the 6 days between the time it was received at Lee's headquarters and the start of the trial on the 4th of July. But it's easy to reconstruct it because of the great attestation by those that read the letter at Lee's quarters. And I'm giving you a synopsis of what they routinely said in the letter to tell you that Lee definitely had attack orders. And the instructions were this: detach 600 to 800 men. You remember, when I say men, that means rank and file, but that could be the equivalent of 1,000 total soldiers. Get within 2 miles of the enemy, observe, send back intelligence. And the key to this, and I think a lot of people tend to overlook this, attack the enemy when they begin to move. And at the same time, or right after Daniel Morgan, who's east of that rear of the Crown forces, as soon as he hears the attack coming from the west, from Englishtown, then he will attack from the east. In other words, hit the rear guard in a sandwich. And then here's the key, and nobody's ever written about this before. The discretion to not attack isn't given to Charles Lee. It's given to the officers that are leading those 2 attacks on the left and on the right. Now you're saying, Gary, I see you're summarizing this, but what's your evidence for that? Look at this, guys. This is the exact testimony of those that read the orders. And these are people, at least 2 of them, very devoted to Charles Lee. John Mercer, for example, will resign in protest when Lee is found guilty, but he, under oath, will testify that when he read the orders, this is what they said. Okay, look, I'm highlighting, I'm not going to read through every part of it, but the force that's sent out to observe is to read it through. Attack the enemy when they begin to move. The second one, and attack, and in case they retire, to attack them, and to attack them in case they begin to move. It's rare to have that strong degree of synchronicity when you're reading these different testimonies, but it's very clear to see that Lee was definitely given written orders to attack. The orders are very precise and positive. So what Washington's looking for, and I've derived a battle plan, and the only one that I'm absolutely 100% confident of, the rest of it is taking it beyond the next level. But if you look at the positions A, the orders are the 2 forces at A, the troops picked to lead out of Englishtown or to attack, and then Daniel Morgan from the southeast is to attack almost simultaneously. And then it's left up to Clinton. He's either going to respond to the rearguard attack by doling off enough troops to repel it and continue his march up to the upper right-hand corner to Middletown, or he will commit the rest of his army, or a large part of it, to get into a general engagement. In other words, Washington's goading him into battle. And Washington, by saying the Grand Army will be in supporting distance, will bring the 14 brigades with him in supporting distance in a tier of defense settings. This is around Combs Hill, with the rest of the advance corps out of Englishtown in between both of those. So you can see how that's supposed to work out. Now, I don't have time to go over what happened next after Lee receives the orders, but let's just say that those orders were thoroughly botched on both sides. Lee received the orders, will send subsequent instructions trying to follow Washington's plan, and he completely obliterates the plan. There will be no attack 3 miles south of Monmouth Courthouse at all at 6 o'clock in the morning, which is when Washington feared they would begin to move. And in fact, Clinton begins to move at 4 a.m., the vanguard, and the rear guard begins to move between 5 and 5:30. So Washington's expecting an attack at 6 in the morning. Why else would you send orders at midnight? And that doesn't occur. All right. In fact, somebody with Lee will, this is David Foreman, a volunteer aide, a militia general. He's from the area. He will conclude in a memorandum right after the battle with this very damning phrase that you see at the bottom. General Lee, from the whole of his conduct that he's explaining that happens in those other bullet statements, appeared determined to avoid fighting. And if you read through all of that and understood it, I could understand why you might believe that. I don't believe that. I think Lee tried to follow Washington's orders, but I have a whole different conclusion about Lee. I think he talked a big game, but he was one of those that really fell to the Peter principle. I think he was an incompetent to handle the amount of troops that he was in charge of. Because what Foreman will talk about in the two bullet statements above is all the confusion that was imparted upon the other commanders within Lee's corps and all the halts that were called that Foreman said was deforming of the troops. So one of the most important maps that I've included in my book, and I'm going to show you folks here, is what you see, the situation at 9 in the morning. And remember, this is Washington expecting a battle to already be a few hours old, and he would be in supporting distance. I'll talk about Washington in a second. But look where Lee is. He's in the middle of that dark iconed mess in the middle of that Cranberry Freehold Road. And the reason why I say that you have to count all soldiers, not just rank and file, but all officers and men, is that because for this map, I have made the icons representative to the number of troops that are in that command. That's how much road space they actually take up. This is the start of a second halt. The first halt lasted almost an hour and a half. The second halt is going to last for nearly an hour. I don't think Lee planned for that to occur. He just has no experience about leading this many troops, and it just completely jams up the road. Clinton and Cornwallis, especially, who no longer is 3 miles south of Monmouth Courthouse, but now is a mile north of it, is working his way toward Middletown, and no Continental forces are within a mile of him at this stage. What about Washington? He's done what he said he would do. He's brought the 14 brigades to Englishtown. He is well within supporting distance. He's only 2 miles from that logjam, and it would be absolutely foolish for him to jam up the road anymore with those troops, especially when the temperature's already past 90 degrees and the only intervening creek bed for 4 miles is at Englishtown. So Washington has his army at the creek waiting for that mess to clear up in the road. And why does Washington know all about this? Because he's got his headquarters at this house that still stands in Englishtown. And these are all the aides that throughout the day have been out visiting Charles Lee throughout the morning. I have images for most of them. What is that? 7 of them. And there's 2 others that I have their names, but I don't have images for. But all of these aides, among other functions, have gone out and visited and spoke with Charles Lee. And Washington has a good idea of what is and what isn't occurring throughout the morning. Finally, at 11:30, Washington can hear what had become started out as desultory firing of cannons for like an hour, hour and a half, to a rolling cannon fire, and that is the distinctive sound of finally he hears battle, and he will move out with the Grand Army to support it. But when Washington gets to position B and moves to position C, Englishtown, by the way, is 2 miles off the page to the left-hand side. Washington's moving where the advance corps was. He sees something that completely appalls him and shocks him. He sees that well-trained, Steuben-trained elite force retreating in front of his eyes, left and right. They're not in panic, and they shouldn't be. Washington can't see one enemy force chasing these guys down, but they are in a mix of order and disorder. Small pockets of men, battalions here and there, retreating to the left and right of him. Nobody with a destination in sight. Nobody could tell him clearly who ordered them to the rear. Nobody could tell him exactly where they were ordered to go. Some of these men would have gone all the way to Englishtown if Washington doesn't stop them at position C. This is the reason for the rally, and this is where the rally begins. Washington, and the time now is 12:45 to 1 o'clock. Washington will start placing troops on the high ground on each side of the morass, most of them on the highest ground west of that West Morass Bridge where Perrines Hill is, put some men in the shade. And just south of that position C, you see the word hedgerow along there. There's a hill just to the left of the hedgerow or to the west of it. Washington will ride up that hill with some of his headquarters staff and overlook the battlefield in front of him. You see that word Point of Woods, which is about 600 yards in front. He's scanning the battlefield as he's watching his troops retreating in front of his eyes, and then he catches sight of the second officer upon the continent, Charles Lee, coming toward him, and that leads to the next phase of this rally. It's called the confrontation. Here's a 1778 map of the Battle of Monmouth, and where I had position C on my map, take a look at it again. Position C. Now look on this map in the center. That's pretty much where position G is. See the G? There's the hedgerow fence below G. This time the cartographer drew the hill to the left, and you see that huge black asterisk there? Go to the key, and it reads the spot where they met. Okay? That pretty clearly tells by visual, and it's well supported by testimony, that exact spot is where Washington confronted Lee. It's well depicted in imagery in the 19th and 20th century in particular, and a little bit in the 21st. Look at this collage of images. Both of these generals are on different colored horses. There you see it again. 4 more images, different colored horses. We don't really know which ones they rode in these battles. And even in that famous Leutze image that I showed you that's hanging in the museums, here is that image, the center of it. That's Lee and Washington, showing the center of the image. That's the confrontation. And I showed you that there were 2 Leutze paintings, one in 1854 and one in 1857. Why were there 2 of them? Well, look at the highlight of Washington's face in the 1854 image. That was the one on public display. And the criticism was that Washington did not look stoic, did not look heroic enough. It was an unflattering look at Washington for him to be angry and scowling. So the way to have him look more spiritual, more calm, more spiritual was to have that repainted, and that was more for the private setting. To be honest, it's the image on the left that probably best represented Washington at the point of confrontation, which occurs at about 10 after 1. Again, that map showing the spot where they met, I've added where in the park they exist. This is called Oswald's Knoll today. This is still called the hedgerow. And I even included the West Morass Bridge because you see it highlighted there. Here's a park map, guys. There's the hedgerow. The X is where I have Oswald's Knoll. That's the site of the confrontation. And I show you the modern Route 522 where the West Morass Bridge is by the modern road. Somebody could tell me in the Q&A. I have a strong suspicion the original roadbed is closer to the railroad track, and the true Morass Bridge was down here. The other thing I want to show you is that the double X is where the interpretive signs are for the confrontation today. And the Point of Woods that I showed you on my map earlier is off this little green patch a little bit to the right. And I got to tell you, I'm personally glad that the interpretive signs aren't on the knoll, all right? Because that's the way it looks today. All right, we're looking a little bit westerly up toward Combs Hill in the rear. There's a hedgerow fence. There's the unobstructed knoll. I like the fact that you can get lost in 1778 by standing upon it without having any modern signage up there. And I think that helps to interpret the area. But that is where Washington confronted Lee, but his first job up there was to look over the battlefield. The confrontation between Washington and Lee was very short, not sweet at all, though. Washington will challenge Lee. What's the reason for the retreat? Why all the confusion? Lee first tries to deny that there was any confusion, says the retreat wasn't his idea, but says once it started, he wasn't able to keep his position in the advance because he was well outnumbered. Washington challenged him on that, saying that all of his staff that had returned to him said that he didn't face nearly the number of men that he thinks he did. He should have held his position. And then Lee eventually let loose the fact that he was dead set against this in council in letters that he had written to Washington that we shouldn't be engaging the British in battle. Remember that idea of building the Bridge of Gold. And then Washington turned to him and said, well, if you truly still think that way, you should never have requested that to take charge of this advanced corps. And then, as one of Lee's aides said very succinctly, Washington he said 3 words. Washington, quote, passed by him. He leaves Lee because he's got to go to the next stage of the rally. Washington quickly sees the battlefield in front of him and knows that he has to build a couple of lines of defense to buy him time for the main line of defense on Perrines Hill. He will first go 600 yards to that point of woods and set up a defense there. Washington personally sets up the defense. In fact, he will take a battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Ramsey. He will grab him by the hands and tell him of his expectations of and his dependence upon Ramsey to at least be able to check the progress of the enemy. So between Ramsey and Stuart, and the overall commander in charge is a reliable commander, Brigadier General Anthony Wayne, they will have a hard fight in an ambush position that Washington sets up, one that is briefly defined here by one of those bas-relief panels on the Monmouth Monument. That doesn't last very long. If you look at my map, Position B is knocked out by these elite 2,500 troops that have come into view. Henry Clinton is personally leading with Cornwallis, guards and grenadiers and the 16th Light Infantry, followed by cannons behind them across these fields from lower right to upper left. And remember, beyond the West Morass Bridge is Perrines Hill. That's where Washington's trying to set up a defense. And Washington, when he goes by Position C again, where he already was, realizes that he needs another force there. Let it be sacrificial lambs, but he needs to buy more time. And the only commander that he sees there is the one that he just was very curt with, and that is Charles Lee. And Washington doesn't give him an order here. He gives him a challenge. He says, either you will defend here in essence, or I will. And I'm quoting one artillery officer who remembers it as Washington saying to Lee, we must determine immediately whether you or I shall command the troops here. Washington is challenging Lee. Are you able to defend this spot? Are you willing to do this? And Lee will assure Washington, General, I will be the last to leave the field. And a defense will be set up here with 2 infantry forces, both of them battalion size, and 2 cannons will be put on the knoll where Washington had his confrontation with Lee. And here's a little brief, a neat little depiction of it. That is the Black Company of the 1st Rhode Island Infantry, an integrated force of the entire regiment, but a separated company led by Tom Arnold, who is the white commander of that. I hear his wife gives a very poor rendition of the national anthem, but I digress there. But this force will fight behind this fence, and you see the redcoats in the distance coming from east to west. And in exchange of 10 volleys, they will be forced away. They are part of Jeremiah Olney's brigade. And I bring that up because I don't have an image for Jeremiah Olney, but here is the hedgerow defenders. The other infantry is led by the lower left here, Livingston. You see the artillerist, Oswald. That's why the knoll has his name. Even Henry Knox is up there briefly. And overall, Charles Lee's in charge. Here's my Charles in charge. I can't believe I just said that. But down at the bottom here, you see that Washington has detached 2 headquarters staff. In fact, Olney and Hamilton will both say in trial testimony that Hamilton is the one that chased down Olney and put him behind the fence. And both Hamilton and Lawrence will lose their horses superintending the action here. Why am I telling you all of this? Because Washington doesn't feel compelled to detach any headquarters staff to assist with Anthony Wayne at the Point of Woods, Washington feels no compulsion to detach any staff to help with Nathaniel Greene detached over at Combs Hill. I think you guys can figure this out. Why has he got his top two aides, his top experienced battlefield aides over here at the hedgerow? Because he doesn't trust Charles Lee. It's obvious. But for his credit, Lee does hold his position as long as he can. And that buys enough time between the Point of Woods and the hedgerow that by the time Lee's force scampers across the West Morass Bridge, you can see that position G, Washington has set up that line of defense up on Perrines Hill. And it's a strong defense. 12 cannon and a lot of infantry coming from Englishtown from the east or from the west, and retreating troops from the east combine up here. Lee will be sent back to Englishtown. And now Clinton will take over the hedgerow and Oswald's Knoll and set up 10 pieces by himself. And now the Battle of Monmouth is going to turn into the largest battlefield, generally an infantry battlefield artillery duel, not counting a naval one, in which you have 22 guns engaged for 2 hours almost nonstop, 1,300 yards away. Washington's rally is continuing here. It's now 2:15 to 2:30, and he is now the mark of inspiration up on Perrines Hill. This is a view of from the American position up in the upper left corner. That would be the 1,300 yards away, looking at Clinton and his force over on Oswald's Knoll now. And here's an image of Washington depicted on Perrines Hill with his Dollard spyglass. And look at these nice accounts by these officers. The one at the bottom was never published. I found this and put this excerpt in my book. It's a neat quote, but it shows that Washington is the model of inspiration at that hill, keeps his men in line, and Clinton is unable to dislodge him from that position. That pretty much ends the 90 minutes of what I would call this continuous rally. But Washington is not done with the battle. He is going to order 4 counterpunches, and I'll briefly end the battle here. 2 of them will actually embark upon their missions. They have the time. The other 2 are essentially ordered too late. Silly and Parker and Wayne. And one of those, Wayne's, is actually depicted in another bas-relief panel on the monument. And you see that depicted, and I'm showing a shortened version of it. Silly and Parker at E, Wayne at position F. It gets complicated because Wayne's thrown back, and then the force that throws him back is thrown back again. By the end of the day, as dusk is enveloping the field, Clinton and his force are driven from the Monmouth battlefield. All right? And get it out of your head that the Battle of Monmouth is a draw. By what tactical definition are we following to call it that? We don't go by casualties, but if you count total losses, Clinton had roughly 500. He underreported his losses, but he had about 500. Washington just a little under 400. But the key here is the phrase that I brought up earlier. I found 6 accounts of the term masters of the field written right after the battle. Now, if you're Henry Clinton and you're off to the end of the battlefield, and you have been so dismissive of the guy that you call Mr. Washington that you won't even give him a rank, okay? And you think that you can beat him in an open field fight, now is the time to do it. The temperature is going to drop 20 degrees overnight. You have a whole fresh corps, technically a division, under Kniphausen that's been resting for 2 days now. Since the late morning of the 26th, they've only moved 4 miles away from you. Bring them back overnight, sniff out Washington's exposed flanks, renew the attack in the morning, drive him from the battlefield. Because if you go all the way to New York, you know you're going to be laid under siege, and that's the rest of the action for you. This is your last chance. Clinton doesn't do it. In modern terms, he punts. He leaves the battlefield and leaves the Americans masters of the field. Read the quote of the officer at the bottom. They are elated to see the redcoats turn their backs to them on the battlefield. Washington personally bivouacs on the battlefield with Lafayette that night. By all measurable descriptions, this is the American tactical victory, because Henry Clinton is unable to renew the battle. Washington has made the battlefield untenable for him to maintain it, and Clinton will continue on to New York. The soldiers will celebrate this for for many days afterwards. It'll be part of the 4th of July celebration 6 days later. In fact, soldiers in their pension accounts 50 years after the fact will say that day we celebrated American independence and our great victory at the Battle of Monmouth. It'll end up in every single series of toasts, TOASTS, celebrated by the Americans on the 4th of July, the great victory at Monmouth. And I want to bring up now Henry Knox. He was the one that told Washington at Valley Forge, I mean, look how blunt he is here. It would be the most criminal degree of madness to hazard a general action at this time. Clearly, just like Wayne, Henry Knox knows that Washington's looking for a general engagement, and he's trying to use the strongest language possible to talk him out of it. That's 10 days before the battle. Look at the change of tune of Henry Knox when he writes to his brother after the battle. And this is just 2 weeks after that criminal letter. The effect of the Battle of Monmouth will be great and lasting. It will convince the enemy and the world that nothing but a good constitution is wanting to render our army equal to any in the world. All right. So he sees the light. He realizes the importance of the general engagement, as does this guy. Read the artillery officer's depiction of Washington's rally on the side as I quickly end with this slide. This is Washington posing for what's considered the first great painting in the history of the United States of America. This is Washington at Princeton, which was completed in 1779. Washington posed for this, but even though it's the Battle of Princeton and the cover of my volume 2, the pose, that confident pose of Washington, couldn't have been done in the winter of 1778 during the Cabal. To recapture that look that Washington had after Princeton, you had to have another great campaign. And for Washington, that was the Battle of Monmouth. So that image is Washington post Monmouth posing for the Battle of Princeton, because even though Washington has no idea that the war is going to last 5 more years, and even though he has no idea that this technically is the last battle that he will command as a field commander, I don't count the siege of Yorktown because that's a siege, Washington realizes that as long as he is in charge of the army and personally lead them on a battlefield, they can stand toe-to-toe with the elite armies on the face of the earth and come out victorious. And no suspect second in commands are going to prevent that in the future. So I'll end this by saying I couldn't disagree more strongly with the quote that I heard at that conference 3 weeks ago. I'll follow what that idiom was. Not only was this Washington, one of Washington's finest hour, but the 90 minutes of that grand rally that occurred within that, quote, finest hour were truly magnificent. I thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Gary. That was something really, really good. Very enjoyable. Um, really appreciate hearing from you tonight. We have a number of questions in the chat, and I'm just
All right.
going to try to see if I can find them, relate them. First question from Carl Barna is, how does your book compare to the recent book Fatal Sunday? And does your book interpret events differently? And if so, why? I know that it does. So
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
how does your book compare to the recent book Fatal Sunday? And does your book interpret events differently? And if so, why?
Well, remember my book's unique because I don't attempt to describe the blow by blow Battle of Monmouth, which Fatal Sunday does. So it's a completely different book from that aspect. My book is to look at these campaigns and battles from the perspective of headquarters. Generally, what did Washington know? When did he know it? What did he do about it? I will say my biggest deviation from Fatal Sunday and from others that have written about Lee is that in Fatal Sunday, they truly believed that Lee didn't receive orders to attack, and he's very sympathetic to Lee. And I could understand if you didn't think Lee received strong or positive orders, that you could sympathize with him. But I think you guys all see from my evidence that I'm showing from the court-martial testimony, he definitely did receive orders to attack. And for that reason, that's our greatest deviation in those 2 books.
Thank you. We got another question from Carl that John answered, and that was how many of the private houses on your map are still standing? And John mentioned that the Craig Ray and Sutphen houses are still at the park, but only the Craig house can be visited. We have a question from Bob Wong.
Okay.
Wasn't Clinton's major goal to leave the battlefield and regroup at the Middletown Heights and then depart for New York City? There was no reason why he would stay to fight any further. Would you comment?
Yeah, yeah, of course I'll comment on that. Clinton's goal was to do that the whole time. He wasn't expecting to be in a battle on Fatal Sunday. My point is he got caught up in a battle and the ball's in his court. So he knows that if he leaves the battlefield, he's left the battlefield to Washington, and that is the mark of Washington owning that field. Yes, his goal was to get to the heights of Middletown and to go to New York from there, and he did accomplish that goal. So you could say strategically, he proceeds on to the campaign. Now he's going to lose through the course of the campaign, including the battle, about 1,200 men. There's a lot of desertions. 420, mostly Hessians, are brought into Philadelphia, and there's a lot of losses afterwards. So he definitely doesn't get through all of that unscathed. So he takes a lot of losses in the process. But my point is, he got engaged in a battle, and the ball's in his court. And if he really thinks that he can defeat George Washington in the only chance to have an open field fight against him, he'll stay another day to do that, and he chooses not to.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Bob Wong. Will you try to have the interpretive signs of the Washington Lee confrontation moved from the Point of Woods to Oswald's Knoll?
The answer there is I think I used to think yes, but I've changed my mind. Okay. And the reason is for the reason I showed you in that picture. I like the fact that you could stand on a part of that battlefield and not have the signage there. Now, I will say that credit to the park, where they have the interpretive signs, they don't make them very specific. The signs don't say exactly here is where the confrontation took place. And if you talk to park personnel, they will acknowledge that it took place on the west side of what is now Wemrock Road, which was the lane to the Wyckoff House. But I've specifically placed it on Oswald's Knoll because the testimony has put it there. So I would say that I prefer maybe the signage to be put closer where the hedgerow fence is because that's where other signage is now. But I'd prefer that the knoll itself stay bare if I had a say in it, which I don't. But I like the fact that there's no signage up there. And Bob, for your sake and for others, there's only been one organized group that I know of that's ever been up on that knoll for the confrontation, and Bob Finelli can tell you this. It was a little group that I had out there last year in February, and that's the only organized group that has been up on the knoll for the reason of the confrontation itself.
And boy, is that something to see. It's worth it. If Gary, next time he gives a tour of Monmouth, if you can join him, you really should. Hey, we've got a couple of other questions here. One of them, I know we're going to stay away from legends that
Let's try.
originated in the from the battle, but Peter Primavera asks about Lieutenant Colonel Monckton. Did you have any comments about that?
Um, well, generally no. Moncton was killed on the battlefield, and he's buried at Tennant Church. And there's a discrepancy in Fatal Sunday. I think he has him mortally wounded on if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks. I might be wrong on this. I think on the west side of the morass bridge, and others had that the mortal wounding occurring on the other side of the bridge. Other than that, I don't have. He was in charge of one of the grenadier battalions, a lieutenant colonel. His brother, for example, was a general of the Crown Forces, so he's well placed in the army, and he's the highest ranking officer to be killed on the field. But I have nothing else to add other than that.
So we have another question about what did Washington try to accomplish during the Council of War?
Well, in the Council of War, the difference is what he used to try to accomplish and what he tried to accomplish later on. Earlier, he depended on the generals to give a consensus opinion in a Council of War, but he started to turn against that later on, and he would actually change some of his councils. Like I'll give you an example. I won't get too wordy about this, but at the one that he held before Germantown, he was so he was so gung-ho about launching an attack at Germantown, he held a council and gave his generals two options. We're going to attack right now, or we're going to wait for reinforcements to come. There wasn't a third option that we're not going to attack. So Washington would set up a series of questions, and he'd usually wait for a written response to come individually from the generals, or a consensus response that the generals would sign for the document and give to him. But what I'm trying to bring forth is by 1778, Washington's using that for the generals to log their opinions because I guess in that sense he is democratic about it, and that if they want their voices heard, they can let their voices be heard. But in general, he's not swayed even by a majority opinion if it goes against his, and that's demonstrated time and time again.
Great. Hey, Dan asks about where the Hopewell Council took place, and he asks if you have an address, but I don't know.
The council, yeah, the house still stands.
Ah,
Um, it's on Province Line Road. It's the Joseph's Stout House, but it's often named after the renter called the John Hunt House. The house has been shifted a little bit because of a falling foundation. It's the same materials. It just basically somewhat was rebuilt, just shifted a little bit toward the milk house that's the original that's there now. I think that happened in the 1830s. And it's just outside of Hopewell, New Jersey. Ironically, well, not ironically, but FYI, it's a mile and a half as the crow flies southeast of the Lindbergh house where the baby was kidnapped in 1933, and that house still stands too.
yeah. Yeah. John Fabiano does mention that the house was owned by Stout but occupied by John
Right,
Price Hunt.
right.
Another question from Peter Primavera. Can you talk about where the court martial took place?
Well, the court martial, and for this you should buy Christian McBurney's book. He and I don't agree on Lee on Lee's conduct in the Battle of Monmouth, but Christian has great attention to the running trial. He's the one that writes about the trial in detail because it's held in so many different places because the army's on the move. For the first few days, it starts in what is now New Brunswick, at I think where the Indian Queen Tavern used to stand. It's been moved since then. And then that's where it starts on July 4th for a couple days. And then when the army begins to move from Brunswick toward White Plain, the trial will shift to, I think, ends up being in 6 different locations. And it begins on July 4th and it ends after the first week of August. And the verdicts are rendered, I think, on August 8th, 9th, or 10th. I can't remember the exact date.
I don't remember the details, but I thought that Lee requested that court martial,
Oh, yeah. Yes.
but you
Most
said
of
he
the
was
generals
arrested.
yeah, because yes, most of the like Sullivan and Wayne also requested court martials during the
Yeah,
Philadelphia campaign. They wanted their day in court.
they wanted vindication. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, we don't have any other questions in the chat, but if anybody would like to ask Gary a question, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question now? Okay, so if you want to unmute, you can go usually to the lower left where it says audio and click on that red line there, and it should allow you to be able to speak.
Fire away if any questions. I want to hear your opinions.
Yeah.
Are you buying into my argument?
Yeah. I have a question. This is Bob Wong.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, hi. You and I have had this discussion about this. Did George Washington adopt the Fabian strategy? I mean, there are many historians, Joseph Ellis and others, who
Right.
and even Mount Vernon has actually in some of their websites mentions Fabian strategy. But I know that you and other historians disagree with that. So this seems like a never-ending solution to this.
Well, Bob, when I run the world, there won't be any discussion about it. No, let's put it this way. Joe Ellis actually, I think, initiated that notion And he makes a very strong case of it at the time he mentions this. But here's the point. His evidence for that was a March 1777 dispatch. And at that time, yes, Washington was a Fabian strategist because he only had 3,000 men. Okay. So that policy ended. I mean, the whole idea of Fabian is that it doesn't mean even defensive if you hold your ground all day long. So the Battle of Brandywine, where Washington's on the defensive all day long, that's not a Fabian battle.
Right.
It's just a defensive battle. But I would say it truly ended after that battle, where Washington is going to be constantly looking as the aggressor and to attack his opponent because he has no fewer than 15 to 18,000 men for the entire Philadelphia campaign. And even when he's at White Marsh, his force is raised up to 24,000 men, and he's looking on several occasions to attack Philadelphia. All right, which is clearly not Fabian at all.
Right.
So Germantown violates Fabian doctrine, and I'm writing a book now about the Battle of the Clouds, and Washington is looking to attack Howe 5 days after the Battle of Brandywine, when he's literally decimated in his Continental infantry, and he's going to attack them on the same battlefield if he can get down there in time, and that's not going to be Fabian either. So the answer to all that is yes. Washington was a Fabian strategist and tactician in mindset only for the spring of 1777. And from the summer onward, when his army grew large enough, he no longer thought that way at all. So the answer is yes and no, but it all has to deal with the timeline. You can't, where I disagree with Ellis is he made this idea in his head that Washington carried that notion for the rest of the war. And there's so many clear examples against that. You know what Washington even said? He wrote to Congress. You'll be surprised at this one, Bob, is that on November 1st, after the Battle of Germantown, and let it be known that at the Battle of Germantown, that is 13,500 men in 13 brigades attacking at the same time. That won't be topped on American soil until the second year of the Civil War, 84 years later. All right, so that's clearly not Fabian. And Washington is telling Congress that even before Howe left Germantown, 2 weeks later, he was looking to hit him again in Germantown. So he's clearly offensive minded, anti-Fabian
Thank you.
from start to finish, from the fall of 77 onward.
Hi, this is Carl Barna. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I thought your presentation was outstanding, and I hope you'll give another tour of Monmouth perhaps in a month or so before it gets too hot.
Yeah, I'm actually I work for a couple different companies, and there'll be a November tour that it's a Monmouth campaign, and it's through Blue Gray Education Society. They were initially a Civil War organization, but they have a whole series of Revolutionary War programs they do as well. So I think it's BGES.com. You could look for my tours there. I'm giving 3 Revolutionary War tours this year, but it includes Monmouth.
I see we had another question from Peter Primavera. How did General Washington use the Village Inn in Englishtown?
He didn't.
Okay.
I know traditionally they have the Village Inn is depicted as the site where he was with Charles Lee when they met with a council of generals on the day before the battle, June 27th. That's the tradition. But if you read the testimony, especially Maxwell's and I think Wayne's as well, it's clear that Washington was in a different site. Now, so I don't. It just seems weird that you would have the two generals in the same building to use as headquarters. Washington would have set up in a different spot. And Washington didn't just have one aide with him; he had at least 4 of his aides with him. So I think he was either in a tent in open ground in Englishtown that afternoon or in a building that I don't know. Now, the only reason I know that Charles Lee was in a tavern is I do have a primary account of that, a memoir from a soldier, physician named Reed, R-E-A-D, but he didn't name it as the Davis Tavern, which is what the Village Inn was known in 1778. He did identify it as a tavern. So if there is another tavern in Englishtown at the time, it could have been there. But if there isn't, then I would pinpoint the Village Inn or the Davis Tavern as Lee's headquarters based on that man's primary source.
So if you want to read Gary's book where he talks about this battle extensively, you can see a link to it in the chat. It's really quite interesting. We have any other questions from the group?
Hey, Bob, it's Peter Primavera.
Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to back up what you said about the Village Inn. In 1990, my firm was contracted to do an extensive archaeological excavation all the way around the Village Inn on all sides. And
Okay.
as you would normally expect, before we did that, we did exhaustive historical research. Everybody Everybody was telling us Washington used the Village Inn before and after, and everybody was telling us that that is where the court martial started. And one in our historical found out exactly what you did. We had no evidence of that at all, and then we archaeologically tested the bejesus out of that thing. I mean, we did massive excavations around all the foundations, the building trenches, the former kitchen in the back. No evidence that any Revolutionary War army had ever used that building. In fact, there was more evidence that it was a tavern, and the most evidence was that it was a tailor shop.
Okay. Well, my first response is how many E's are in bejesus? So you can work on that one. The second thing I would say is I still am I'm not discounting that it was Lee's quarters, but I think Washington, the night after the night of the battle, he was on the battlefield. And traditionally, he's in the Moses Laird house for dinner the following night. And he probably stayed there. I can't prove that, but a lot of times we don't have receipts for Washington headquarters, and it doesn't. It's one of those, and I've said this before. The absence of evidence really isn't the evidence of absence just because we don't have a receipt for it. But I'm quite confident Washington never used the Davis Tavern or the Village Inn for his quarters. But based on one primary account, Lee did use a tavern, and I don't know. I honestly don't know the village of Englishtown well enough in 1778 to know how many homes were established as taverns. But that could have been Lee's quarters. In other words, when they said the court martial started there, if Lee did use that as his quarters, it's where he would have been arrested. But it's not where the court martial began, because he was arrested on June 30th, then accompanied the army on its march northward through Spotswood and then to what is now New Brunswick. And that's where the court martial begins on the 4th of July.
There were three taverns.
Oh, there were. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there were three taverns. Yeah, and so that backs up what you're saying again. There were three taverns at that intersection where the Village Inn was.
Okay, that's
Village Inn is
interesting.
the
I
only
didn't
one
know
that's Village Inn is the only one that survived.
Okay.
And I think that's how the legend got attached to it.
Okay. Well, but again, it's hard to disprove that it was Lee's quarters. I know you've done the archaeology. I guess that could be part of it. But if those three taverns were that close to each other and you went all around him, he had to. I think he used one of them. I don't know which one, but I think in my book I talk about the tradition. I definitely don't claim Washington was there, but I say that based on the tradition, it's not unreasonable to put Lee there. But I'll follow what I'm a big believer in archaeological discoveries, and please follow up with me on email. I'd love to know more about some of the things you've discovered out there.
Hey, Gary, so a question for you. If Lee requested a court martial, why was he arrested?
There's a series of letters that are exchanged between Lee and Washington, and if their headquarters were where I think they were, their quarters were only 100 yards apart. So these things are getting transferred just 100 yards in the town from north to south. which eventually is going to lead to Lee's arrest, whatever tavern he was in. And I can't remember the specific um, timeline of when he requests from a court of inquiry to an actual court martial, and I'm not an expert on how that broke down. I do think I talk about it in my book, but it's completely left my mind at this stage. But when he gets arrested, it's going to be a court martial charge. I think the discussion about requesting the court martial is prior to that. And you're absolutely right. You don't have to be arrested to have a court martial trial. Perfect example is Sullivan and Wayne for Paoli and for Brandywine and the Staten Island campaign for Sullivan and Paoli, I just said for Wayne. They requested court martials and they never left the army while those court martials took place. But Washington was so adamant that Lee was guilty after he's garnering the evidence, and after Lee wrote some very disrespectful letters to Washington, he made sure that he was going to twist the knife into him, and he did arrest him.
Okay. So Steve says your presentation was excellent and asks, was
Thank
Clinton
you.
ever reprimanded for his decision to retreat from the battle?
Oh no, no, not at, well. Thank you for the comment on the talk. No, and I think it was Bob Wong that said this. He's absolutely right. I mean, Clinton. My whole point about Clinton having the opportunity is that he's very dismissive of Howe for not being able to take care of George Washington in an open field fight. And my whole point was, here's the only opportunity he's going to have for
Yeah.
the rest of the war is take this on. Not that he could have won the battle that day, but he could have clearly gone on the next day to fight it. So the fact that he goes to Middletown is definitely inconsistency with his instructions to retreat to New York. I think they're happy that he didn't lose any other men and engage them in battle at that time. What I will dismiss, and I've heard this sometimes, is that he was in a hurry because of D'Estaing's fleet that was heading toward there, and that's not the case at all. Clinton basically slow marched his march in the first 35 miles into New Jersey to goad Washington to come down and battle him on the ground of his choosing. So he's not in a huge hurry to escape through New Jersey, but he is completing his orders to do that. I hope that answered that.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself and ask Gary.
I'm showing my Italian with my hand motions here. I'll have to
Hey.
keep that under wraps here.
Hey, so I just want to let you know that this Thursday, the North Jersey Roundtable is going to have a really interesting talk about Johann Ewald, who's one of the coolest figures in the American Revolution. So if you would like to get an invite to that, you can send a note to this email address here and hopefully join with Bob Wong and Linda Wistermeyer and Barbara Demarest and company on Thursday. I also want to show you what we've got coming next. We meet quarterly, as you may know. And in June, I'm going to be talking about my recent book about Lydia Dara. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to do that. We're probably still going to do that on Zoom, but by September, we hope to have the new Visitors Center built at Washington's Crossing in New Jersey. It'll be up on the bluff on the Jersey side. You'll be able to see it from the Pennsylvania Visitors Center. And we're going to have an auditorium there, and we hope to start doing our roundtable presentations back on Saturday afternoons at 1 o'clock. And Frederica Baer is going to speak with us in September about her recent book about the Hessians, the German soldiers in the Revolution. And then in December 12th, we're going to hear from Larry Kidder, who's written a number of books about the 10 crucial days and events in the Washington Crossing and Trenton area, Princeton area. And he's going to be talking with us about the other crossings of the Delaware, which is the subject of a book that he's working on right now. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for these, and you'll be getting messages from me and be able to see these announcements with some of the different groups that are in the area. So before we go, do we have any final questions for Gary? If not, I just want to say
Bob,
thank you. Hey, here we go. Go ahead.
Bob, Peter again. Since we have a minute,
Sure.
I'll tell a 30-second story that I think this group will appreciate.
Great.
Yeah, another archaeological study we did on the battlefield a number of years ago. We were hired by New Jersey Natural Gas. They were going to build a 37-mile long gas pipeline that started on Wemrock Road and went all the way down to like Tom's River. Their original route went right through the middle of the battlefield for this pipeline. And it even went right through where the crossing was in the middle of the marsh, where possibly the bridge was. And so before we strongly recommended they don't do it, and we strongly recommended they reroute. We strongly recommended they avoid the battlefield no matter what. But they wanted us to do a research design. Well, what if we were going to do archaeological testing across the battlefield? And we put together a complex design. We presented to the American Battlefield Organization in the National Park Service. And as the old timers on this call will remember, the SHPO archaeologist was a fellow named Jonathan Gell back then. And he commented to us after we finished this elaborate research design that he had found evidence that Lieutenant Colonel Monckton's head had been blown off by artillery fire, and that our research should be to find Colonel Monckton's head. And we laughed, and we still laugh to this day over that request.
That is pretty funny. Wow. Hey, so Gary, just want to say thank you once again. This was a great talk. I think you guys will find Gary's book interesting if you haven't already read it. And thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.